The day Eva Fletcher told her father she would not marry Garrett Hollies, the sky above Sutter's Valley turned the color of a bruise, purple and swollen at the edges, like the land itself had absorbed the blow. She stood in the great room of the Fletcher ranch house, the largest structure for 40 miles in any direction, surrounded by mounted longhorn skulls and portraits of men who had taken everything they wanted and never once apologized for it. And she looked her father, Cornelius Fletcher, square in the eye and said the words that would echo through the valley for a year. "I am going to marry Elijah Lawson." The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of a man deciding whether to roar or to calculate. Cornelius Fletcher was a cattle baron in the truest and most ruthless sense of the word. He had built his empire from a single cow and a borrowed rifle, and he had never once in 60 years of living encountered an obstacle he could not steamroll or buy, or simply wait out until it collapsed under the weight of his indifference. But what Eva had just said was not an obstacle. It was a declaration of war. "You will repeat that," Cornelius said, his voice low and controlled in the way that a loaded pistol is controlled. "Elijah Lawson," Eva said again, "the man who has been building fence on the eastern boundary. The man you hired 2 months ago and have barely looked at since. A fence builder." The words fell from Cornelius like stones dropped into still water. "A day laborer, a man who owns nothing. A man who is honest," Eva said, "which is more than can be said for Garrett Hollies." Cornelius moved then, not toward her but to the window, and he stared out at the thousands of acres that bore his name, the cattle that numbered in the thousands, the hands who rode in his employ, the empire he had intended to pass to a son he never had and so had tried instead to sell through his daughter's hand to the most powerful ally available. Garrett Hollies was that ally. His ranch abutted the Fletcher land to the north, and together the two properties would have formed a kingdom. Without the marriage, they were simply two powerful men with a shared fence line. "You have made a mistake," Cornelius said quietly. "The worst of your life." "No," Eva said, and her voice did not shake even once, though her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. "The worst mistake in my life would have been marrying Garrett Hollies and spending the rest of my days pretending I did not know what he truly is." She walked out of the room. Behind her, she heard her father say nothing at all, and somehow that was more frightening than any roar would have been. It had started 8 weeks before that confrontation, in the golden dry heat of September 1878, when the Sutter's Valley had not seen rain in 6 weeks, and the grass along the eastern boundary of the Fletcher land was standing pale and brittle as old paper. Eva had been riding that boundary on her gray mare, Sadie, doing what she did most mornings, which was to ride far enough from the main house that she could hear herself think without the constant noise of her father's ambitions pressing against her skull. She had heard the hammering before she saw him. A rhythmic, confident sound. Each blow landed with exactly the right amount of force, no wasted effort, no hesitation. She came around the bend in the creek where the cottonwoods grew thicker, and there he was. Elijah Lawson, 27 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way that comes from real work rather than vanity, his dark hair damp at the temples, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He was sinking a fence post with a mechanical efficiency that was almost beautiful to watch, each movement precise and economical, and he had not yet noticed her. Eva reined Sadie in and watched him for a moment she would later be embarrassed to admit the length of. He had been hired 2 weeks prior. She knew that. Her father's foreman, a blunt, square man named Dobbs, had brought on 3 men to repair and extend the eastern boundary fence, following a dispute with a neighboring homesteader named Burl Crane who kept letting his cattle drift onto Fletcher land. Eva had seen Elijah at a distance before, a figure moving along the tree line, but she had not been close enough to look at him clearly until now. He drove the post home with a final blow and straightened, and that was when he turned and saw her. He did not startle. He simply looked at her with a steadiness that she was not accustomed to from men who worked on her father's land. Most of them dropped their eyes when a Fletcher looked at them directly. It was a learned response, built from watching what happened to men who held their gaze too long around Cornelius. Elijah Lawson held his gaze. "Morning," he said. His voice was even, measured, not deferential and not aggressive. "Good morning," Eva said. "You are one of the fence builders." "I am," he agreed. "Elijah Lawson, and you are Miss Fletcher." "Eva," she said, because she disliked the way Miss Fletcher sounded coming out of other people's mouths, like she was something to be handled rather than spoken to. He nodded once and turned back to his work, measuring the next post placement with a length of rope, and something about the uncomplicated directness of it made her want to stay and watch, which was not a feeling she had anticipated, and which surprised her enough that she turned sadie and rode away before she could do anything about it. She went back the next morning, and the morning after that. She told herself it was her habit to ride the eastern boundary. She told herself it had nothing to do with the sound of hammering, or the sight of a man who looked at her without the peculiar calculation she saw in the eyes of every rancher and banker and cattleman who attended her father's dinner parties. On the third morning, Elijah had a question about the placement of the fence corner, and he asked her, knowing she knew this land as well as anyone. She answered him. He thanked her simply and without performance. She found herself dismounting, though she could not afterwards say exactly when she had decided to do it. They talked for perhaps 20 minutes, about the fence line, about the dry season, about the way the cottonwoods along the creek marked where the old wagon trail had run before her father had rerouted it north. It was the most comfortable conversation she had had in years. Elijah Lawson, she would learn, had come to Sutter's Valley from Kansas, where he had grown up on a small homestead that had been absorbed by a larger cattle operation during the droughts of the early 1870s. He had watched his family lose everything they had built to a man who simply had more lawyers and more money and more willingness to use both without conscience. He had been 17 then. He had spent the decade since learning everything there was to know about land boundaries and fence construction and property law, because he had decided that the language of lines drawn in the dirt was something he needed to be fluent in. He had worked his way west, job by job, saving what he could, with a long and particular plan in mind. He did not tell her all of this on those first mornings. It came out slowly, the way things do when two people begin to trust each other in increments. What she noticed first was something more immediate, the quality of his attention. When she spoke, he listened without waiting for his turn. When she laughed, he did not quickly mirror it or perform delight. He simply smiled, a quiet thing that transformed his face in a way that she found herself thinking about at unsuitable times. The valley's social machinery was already in motion around her, grinding toward the outcome her father wanted. Garrett Hollies had been calling at the ranch every Sunday for 3 months. He was 34, handsome in a hard-edged way, proprietor of the largest cattle operation north of the valley, and possessed of an easy social confidence that most people mistook for warmth. He sat at her father's table and talked about land consolidation and water rights and the future in terms that made her feel like a parcel being parceled out. He looked at her the way her father looked at acreage, calculating the yield. She had tried to tell her father what she felt about Garrett. Cornelius had listened with the patient expression he wore when someone was saying something he had already decided was irrelevant, and then he had said, "Garrett Hollies is the most strategically advantageous match in the entire state, Eva. This is not a matter of feeling." It was after that conversation, riding back along the eastern boundary with her thoughts in a tangle, that she had first really talked to Elijah, not the polite exchange about fence posts. She had found him eating his midday meal in the shade of the cottonwoods, and she had said, with a bluntness she did not plan, "Do you believe a person can be sold?" He had looked at her for a moment without speaking, and then said, "I believe it happens more often than people admit to." "And if it was happening to you?" She asked. "I would find a way to refuse it," he said, "whatever the cost." She had looked at him for a long time. Then she sat down in the shade across from him, and they talked for 2 hours, and when she rode home that evening, she knew that something had shifted inside her that could not be unshifted. Elijah, for his part, had not permitted himself to feel what he was beginning to feel without first having a very direct internal argument about the wisdom of it. He was a man who had built his life on clear-eyed practicality. He had come to Sutter's Valley with a purpose that had nothing romantic in it. He had learned through careful inquiry that the eastern boundary of the Fletcher land ran adjacent to the old Crane homestead, and that the boundary was actively in dispute, and that there was a legal document filed in the county record's office in Borden City that suggested the original survey of the Fletcher property had been incorrectly executed in 1864, potentially placing a significant section of eastern grazing land rightfully outside the Fletcher claim. He wanted to understand the boundary. He wanted to understand the land. He did not want to become entangled with the daughter of the man who was at the center of everything he had come here to examine. And yet, there were things about Eva Fletcher that refused to remain at a professional distance. The sharpness of her mind was the first of them. She knew this land with an intimacy that came from years of riding it alone, studying it with the attention most people reserved for things they loved. She knew which draws flooded in the spring and which stayed dry, where the old Comanche trail markers had been set into the stones of the creek bed, which stands of timber the Fletcher operation had cleared, and which they had left standing, and why. She had opinions about all of it, clearly formed opinions, and she stated them without apology or qualification, and she was usually right. The second thing was simpler and harder to categorize. She was the only person in Sutter's Valley who had ever asked him what he thought without wanting anything from his answer. He told himself to be careful. He told himself that she was the daughter of the most powerful man in the valley, a man who viewed fence builders the way he viewed fence posts, as temporary necessities that could be replaced when they wore out or got inconvenient. He told himself that what he was feeling was a complication he could not afford. He told himself all of this regularly, and continued to meet her in the shade of the cottonwoods every time she came to the eastern boundary. In the third week, she brought him a book. It was a battered copy of a geography of the American West, annotated in the margins in a slanted, confident hand that he recognized as hers. He looked through it and found that her margin notes were sharper and more precise than the text itself, and he looked up at her with an expression he could not fully control, something close to wonder, and she looked slightly embarrassed and said she had just thought he might find it useful. He kept the book beside his bedroll for the rest of the time he was in the valley. In the fourth week, she told him about Garrett Hollies. Not just the broad facts of it, but the specific quality of the dread she felt when she was in his presence. The way he touched her hand at the dinner table in a way that her father noticed and approved of, and she tolerated with her teeth clenched. The way he talked about her future as though she had already been consulted and consented to it. The way he had once, in a garden corridor, leaned close enough to her ear to make her step back sharply, and the way he had smiled at her reaction as though her discomfort was something that belonged to him. Elijah had gone very still while she described that last part. Then he had said carefully, "Has he done anything that requires an immediate response?" She understood what he was asking. "No," she said, "not yet, but the pressure is building. My father has set a time before the end of the year." "That gives you time," Elijah said. "For what?" she asked. He held her gaze. "To decide what you truly want, and to make sure you have the means to pursue it regardless of what anyone else intends." She had looked at him for a long moment. "You sound like a man who has thought about how to resist powerful people." "I have thought about little else," he said, "for the past 10 years. It was 2 days after that conversation that she kissed him first. She had come to the eastern boundary in the early morning, before the heat built, and found him already at work. She had dismounted and walked to where he was working, and she had said his name, and when he turned she had kissed him. It was direct and deliberate and absolutely without hesitation, because she had decided in the 2 days since their last conversation that deliberate was the only way she knew how to do anything that mattered. He was still for just a fraction of a second, and then he kissed her back. And when they separated, he looked at her with an expression she had no previous category for, something that held equal parts of something rich and carefully guarded, and something she recognized as a mirror of what she had been feeling for weeks. "Eva," he said, very quietly. "I know," she said. "I know what this is. I know what it could cost both of us. I need you to know I am not asking for anything you are not willing to give freely." He put his hand along the side of her face, and his thumb traced her cheekbone, and he said, "I am willing to give more than I have any right to offer." They began to meet with deliberate intention after that. There was nothing hidden about the practical facts of their meetings. She rode the eastern boundary every morning as she always had. What was hidden was the depth of what was building between them. They talked about everything. He told her about his family's homestead in Kansas, the way the land had looked in the spring, the particular smell of the creek that ran through it, the morning his father had come inside from talking to the men who had bought the mortgage and sat at the kitchen table and said nothing for 4 hours. He told her about the anger he had carried since then, the way it had eventually organized itself from something chaotic into something purposeful, a commitment to understanding the law and the language of land rights, so that nothing like that could happen to him again or to anyone he cared about. She told him things she had told no one else. That she had spent 2 years reading every legal document related to the Fletcher properties, not because her father had asked her to, but because she was hungry to understand the mechanism of the power she had grown up inside. That she had found in those years of reading things that troubled her, discrepancies in the survey records, accounts from neighboring homesteaders that did not match her father's version of how certain land had been acquired. She had not known what to do with what she found, and she had folded it away and carried it quietly because raising it with her father would have been like raising a concern about the weather, acknowledged and dismissed in the same breath. Elijah listened to all of it with an absolute focus that made her understand slowly that some of what she was describing was not new information to him. In the 5th week, she asked him directly, "What brought you specifically to Sutter's Valley?" He was quiet for long enough that she knew the answer was not simple. "I came because of the boundary dispute," he said at last. "The one involving the eastern land, your father's property and the old Crane homestead." She held very still. "Go on." "Burl Crane's grandfather filed a homestead claim in 1863, Elijah said. "The same year Cornelius Fletcher arrived in this valley with a land patent that had been issued in Austin. There was a survey that year and another in 1864. The 1864 survey gave Fletcher a parcel that a correct reading of the 1863 homestead filing would have placed inside the Crane boundary. The eastern grazing land," Eva said. "Yes. You came here to build a legal case," she said, "not an accusation. A statement of fact, laid flat and examined." "I came here to understand what had happened," he said, and there was something in his face that was more than legal interest, something older and more personal. "Burl Crane is not a stranger to me, Eva. His grandmother and my grandmother were sisters. He is my second cousin. I know what the loss of that grazing land did to his operation. And I know your father has known for years that the boundary is incorrect and has chosen to maintain it because no one has had the resources to challenge it in court." The silence between them was heavy and particular. She was staring at the creek. He was watching her face. "Why did you tell me?" she asked. "Because I am not willing to pursue this without your knowledge," he said. "Everything that has grown between us, I needed you to know the full truth of why I am here. You deserve that. Whatever you decide to do with it, you deserve the truth." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The 1864 survey. I have seen the original documents. I have always thought there was something wrong with them." "There is," he said. "Then we need to look at it together," she said. It was in that moment, perhaps, more than in the kiss or the long conversations or the book she had given him, that something was permanently and irrevocably sealed between them. Not romance, though that was certainly present. Something beyond it, a recognition, a shared commitment to honesty even when honesty was costly. What she had not anticipated was how quickly the hidden thing would be forced into the open. Garrett Hollies was a man who paid careful attention to things he owned and things he intended to own. He had begun to sense, over the previous weeks, that Eva's Sunday manner had changed, had cooled in some subtle but consistent way that his finely tuned sense of control found intolerable. He was not a man who tolerated the possibility of a plan unraveling. He had his own network of information, men on the Fletcher payroll whose continued employment was quietly supplemented by his occasional generosity. And through this network, he became aware, in the 6th week of Elijah's employment on the eastern boundary, that Eva Fletcher was spending extended time daily with a fence builder. The morning that Garrett rode to the eastern boundary and found them both there, she sitting on the creek bank with a length of survey paper unrolled across her lap and Elijah leaning close to look at something she was pointing to. Garrett felt the particular cold clarity of a man who has identified a betrayal that has not yet been punished. He pulled his horse up 10 feet away and sat there, and both of them looked up at him, and neither of them moved with the guilt or the flinching he had expected. "Miss Fletcher," Garrett said, his voice smooth and cold as river stone, "I was not aware you had an interest in fence work." Eva did not stand. She rolled the survey paper carefully and set it aside. "Good morning, Garrett." "What is this?" Garrett asked, his eyes moving to Elijah with a slow inventory that was designed to communicate contempt. "A conversation," Eva said. "I was not aware I needed to account for my conversations to you." "You will," Garrett said, and the control in his voice slipped just barely, a hairline fracture through the smooth surface of it. "When we are married, you most certainly will." "Then it is fortunate," Eva said, standing now, brushing dust from her riding skirt, "that we are not married." Garrett looked at Elijah with a particular species of threat that did not require words. Elijah met his gaze without expression. They watched each other for a moment with the specific tension of two men who have understood each other perfectly, without saying anything. And then Garrett pulled his horse around and rode north at a pace that communicated the violence he was currently restraining. "He will go to your father," Elijah said. "Yes," Eva said, "he will." "Does that change anything for you?" She looked at him steadily. "It means the timeline has moved. We have less time than we thought." "Then we need to work faster," Elijah said. "On which problem?" she asked. "The boundary or the other one?" He looked at her and something warm and certain moved through his face. "On all of them," he said. "All of it together." Garrett did not go to her father that day. He was more calculating than that. He went first to a man named Roper Hadley, who served as both his legal agent and his most reliable instrument of pressure. Roper Hadley was known through 3 counties as a man who could find the exact right leverage and apply it without leaving visible marks. He had done this work for Garrett on 2 previous occasions, and both previous occasions had ended with the troublesome party departing the valley entirely. Hadley took his instructions and a roll of banknotes and began to do what he did. The first thing that happened was that Dobbs, the Fletcher foreman, came to Elijah at the end of the work day with a shift in his expression that was not comfortable for him, but which he carried out anyway because his own employment rested on the goodwill of the man paying him. "Mr. Fletcher wants the fence crew moved to the northern boundary," Dobbs said, "starting tomorrow." "The eastern boundary work is not finished," Elijah said. "It doesn't need to be finished," Dobbs said and looked at a point slightly past Elijah's shoulder. "It just needs to be moved." "Who asked for this change?" Elijah said. Dobbs said nothing. The silence was specific enough to answer the question without answering it. Elijah nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "I will move to the northern boundary." He did not tell Dobbs what he had already done, which was to spend the previous 3 evenings in Borden City with a land attorney named Sinclair Marsh, who had reviewed the survey documents that Eva had quietly provided to Elijah, and who had confirmed that the discrepancy was substantial enough to support a formal challenge in the county court. The papers had already been filed. Whatever pressure was applied to Elijah's work placement on the Fletcher property was now, in the legal sense, irrelevant. He told Eva that evening at the creek, meeting her in the last hour of light. He told her about Roper Hadley and about what Dobbs had communicated, and he told her about Sinclair Marsh and the filing. She absorbed it all with the particular stillness she had when processing something large. Then she said, "My father is going to hear about this very soon." "I know," Elijah said. "Eva, you need to understand what this means. The challenge to the boundary will put me directly in opposition to your father, publicly and legally. Whatever you feel about me, whatever we are to each other, this is going to make everything harder. If you want to step away from this, now is the moment to do it." She looked at him with an expression that held something close to impatience. "When did you begin to confuse caution with cowardice?" she said. He blinked. "I have read those documents myself," she said. "I have known for 2 years that the eastern boundary was wrong. I did nothing about it because I did not have the means or the knowledge of how to proceed. You do. Burl Crane deserves to have that land returned to him. That is not negotiable for me. What my father is going to say about it is not the point." "There will be more than words from your father," Elijah said carefully. "A man like Cornelius Fletcher, when he feels his property is threatened, does not restrict himself to conversation." "I know who my father is," Eva said, and her voice was firm and clear and a little sad. "I have always known. It is one of the things I have had to carry." He reached out and took her hand, and she held it, and they sat by the creek in the last of the light, and neither of them pretended that the path ahead was simple. The boundary challenge filing became public knowledge within 4 days, as these things do in small communities where information moves faster than horses. The legal notice was posted in the office of the Borden City Courier, as required, and by the Thursday of that week it had been read aloud in the parlor of the general store, the barber shop, and at least 2 ranch kitchens. By Friday it was the only topic of conversation in Sutter's Valley. Cornelius Fletcher read it for the first time in his study on Friday morning. He read it twice. Then he stood and walked to the window and stood there for 7 minutes without moving, which was a thing he did when calculating how to destroy something. His first move was to send for Roper Hadley directly, bypassing Garrett Hollies entirely. He understood now that Garrett's attempt to simply relocate the fence builder had not addressed the underlying problem. Cornelius Fletcher had not built an empire by reacting slowly, and he did not intend to start now. Roper Hadley came and received his instructions. The instructions were specific, and the compensation was substantial. Hadley was to find every vulnerability in Elijah Lawson's filing, every procedural irregularity in the documents, every possible delay mechanism, and to simultaneously investigate Elijah Lawson's background with the intention of finding something that could be used to discredit him. What Hadley found 2 days later was not what he expected. Elijah Lawson's background was clean. His legal filings were meticulous. Sinclair Marsh had done exemplary work. There was nothing procedurally vulnerable in the challenge. This was not information Hadley wanted to bring to Cornelius Fletcher, but he was professional enough to do it. Cornelius sat with this information and then asked a different question entirely. What does the man care about? The answer, which Hadley delivered with a careful lack of expression, was, "Your daughter, sir." The look that crossed Cornelius Fletcher's face at that moment was not the anger that everyone expected. It was something colder and more calculated, the recognition of a leverage point. He sent a message to Eva that evening asking her to come to the study. The conversation that followed was the one that would later be compressed in the Valley's retelling into a single dramatic scene, though the reality of it was slower and more intricate than the legend allowed for. Cornelius laid out what he knew: the meetings at the creek, the survey documents, the legal filing, the relationship between Elijah and Burl Crane. He laid it out without accusation and without raised voice, in the manner of a man who considers information to be a tool. "You helped him," Cornelius said. "You gave him the documents." Eva did not deny it. "I did. You understand what you have done to this family," Cornelius said. I understand what those documents reveal about how this family acquired certain land, Eva said. A very long pause. Do you have any idea, Cornelius said, and now there was something in his voice that was not pure calculation, something older and more painful, how hard it was to build what I have built, what I sacrificed. I know some of it, she said, and I know that not every sacrifice was yours to make. Some of it was made by people who were never asked. Cornelius looked at her for a long time. If you continue with this man, he said finally, I will not forgive it. If you walk away from what I have planned for you, I will disinherit you entirely. You will have nothing. You will be the wife of a fence builder with no land, no money, no family support. You will have nothing. I will have him, Eva said. Cornelius stood. He pointed at the door. Get out of this house, he said. Tonight. You are not welcome here until you have come to your senses. She looked at him for a moment and she said quietly, I love you, Father. I always will. But I will not be the instrument of your ambitions any longer. She packed a single bag. She went out through the kitchen door and saddled Sadie in the dark. And she rode to the house of a woman named Millie Garner, a widow who lived on the western edge of the valley and who had been Eva's confidant since childhood. Millie opened the door at midnight without surprise, as though she had been half expecting this, and said, Come in, child. Tell me everything. The valley exploded. The news traveled with the speed particular to small communities built around gossip and rivalry. Cornelius Fletcher's daughter had left the ranch. Cornelius Fletcher's daughter had been seen riding the eastern boundary with a fence builder for weeks. Cornelius Fletcher had thrown his daughter out. Eva Fletcher was staying with Millie Garner. The boundary challenge was tied to all of it. Garrett Hollies was furious. The fence builder was some kind of outlaw. The fence builder was a land lawyer in disguise. Eva Fletcher had lost her mind. Eva Fletcher had never had more of her mind. Every version contained some kernel of truth and a substantial addition of invention, which is the way of valleys in 1878. Elijah heard about Eva's situation before dawn the next day, when one of the younger hands from the Fletcher operation came to find him at the boarding house, where he had been staying in the weeks since moving off the eastern boundary. The hand, a 19-year-old named Cato Reeves, who had a loyalty to Eva going back to the years when she had personally argued for his continued employment after a minor incident with one of Cornelius's prize bulls, relayed everything in a breathless rush. Elijah was moving toward the door before Cato had finished speaking. He rode to Millie Garner's house as the sky was turning gray in the east, and he knocked on the door, and Eva opened it herself. She was dressed already, her hair braided, her face carrying the marks of a night that had not involved much sleep but also carrying something else, something he could only describe as resolution. A decision made and settled into. You heard, she said. I came as fast as I could, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Are you frightened, she asked. Of your father? He considered the question honestly. I am aware of what he is capable of. I am not frightened of it in a way that changes anything for me. Then come inside, she said. Millie has coffee and we have a great deal to discuss. Millie Garner was 63 years old and had outlived 2 husbands, 1 cattle boom, 1 extended drought, and more than 1 man who had underestimated her. She fed Elijah cornbread and coffee, and watched the 2 of them with the shrewd attention of someone who had seen a great many varieties of love and could identify the real kind on sight. Well, she said, after they had talked for an hour, the practical question is what you intend to do next and how quickly you intend to do it. The boundary case goes before the district court in Borden City in 3 weeks, Elijah said. Sinclair Marsh has the documents in order. Unless Hadley finds a judge willing to delay the hearing, we should have a ruling within 6 to 8 weeks of the hearing date. And you believe the ruling will be in your favor, in Crane's favor? Millie asked. The survey error is documented and clear, Elijah said. The original 1863 homestead filing is intact in the territorial records. The 1864 survey that gave Fletcher the parcel was conducted by a surveyor who also had a paid relationship with the Fletcher operation, which Marsh has documented. It is not a weak case. Fletcher will apply every pressure he can find to that judge, Millie said. He will, Elijah agreed. But there are limits to what even a powerful man can do when the documentary record is this clear. Eva had been listening to this with her chin in her hand, turning something over. My father's true vulnerability, she said slowly, is not the boundary case alone. It is everything the boundary case opens up. If the 1864 survey is successfully challenged, it raises questions about other surveys conducted in that period. There were 4 other boundary adjustments made in the same decade, all favoring Fletcher land, all conducted through the same surveyor. Millie and Elijah both looked at her. I read everything, Eva said simply. I have been reading it for 2 years. I just did not know what to do with what I read. We bring all of it to Marsh, Elijah said. Everything you have, every document, every record, every discrepancy. There is something else, Eva said. Something I did not mention before because I was not certain it was relevant. In my father's desk, the locked drawer he thinks no one knows about, there is a letter. It is from the surveyor, a man named Alton Price, who died in 1871. The letter was written 2 months before his death. It is, if I have read it correctly, an admission that several of the surveys he conducted for my father were altered from their original measurements. The silence in Millie's kitchen was dense and particular. You have read this letter, Elijah said carefully. I found it when I was 17, Eva said. I did not fully understand its implications then. Now I do. Is it still in that drawer? Millie asked. Unless my father has moved it, Eva said. I do not believe he knows I have seen it. Eva, Elijah said slowly, I need you to understand something before we go any further with this. What you are describing, using that letter, will expose your father to serious legal liability. It could mean the loss of significant portions of his land. It could mean consequences far beyond a single boundary dispute. She looked at him levelly. I know, and you are prepared for that. I have been preparing for it for 2 years, she said. Without knowing it, every document I read, every discrepancy I noted, I was building towards something I did not have a name for yet. Now I do. She paused. The people my father displaced, the families who lost their land to those adjusted surveys, they have spent years building operations on land that should have been larger, running cattle on ranges that were shortened by deliberate fraud. They deserve to know the truth. Elijah looked at her for a long moment, and what he felt was something so large and specific that it required him to look down at his coffee cup for a moment before he trusted himself to speak. I love you, he said, not a declaration made for effect, a simple statement of a fact that had become so obvious that continuing to leave it unsaid would have been a form of dishonesty. Eva looked at him, and Millie looked at her cornbread with a satisfied expression that she did not bother to hide. I love you too, Eva said, very much, and I intend to prove it by not asking you to choose between me and the truth. There is no choice, he said. They are the same thing. The next morning, Eva returned to the Fletcher ranch. Not in submission, but with intention. She knew the house, its rhythms and its blind spots, in a way that no one else alive did. She knew that her father met with his foreman at 7 in the morning and was occupied in that meeting for no less than 45 minutes. She knew that the study was unlocked during those meetings because Cornelius Fletcher did not believe anyone on his property would dare to enter his study uninvited. She entered at 7:15. The locked drawer was where it had always been. She had once, at 17, found the key in the hollow base of the inkwell on the desk, and she found it there again now. She opened the drawer. The letter from Alton Price was there, folded twice, slightly yellowed at the edges. She took it. She took 3 other documents she found alongside it, records that she had not seen before, receipts and correspondence that would later prove to be the most damning elements of the case. She was out of the study and out of the house and back on Sadie's back in 16 minutes. Garrett Hollies, meanwhile, had spent the days since Elijah's boundary filing in a state of cold and building rage that he had been managing with less and less success. His control over the situation had evaporated in stages, and he did not manage the feeling of losing control well. He had dispatched Roper Hadley to find legal vulnerabilities and found them to be minimal. He had attempted through Dobbs to move Elijah off the eastern boundary and found that it had not addressed the underlying problem. He had spoken to Cornelius Fletcher and found that Fletcher's response to the situation had shifted from Garrett's preferred outcome, which was that Elijah simply be removed from the picture, to something more complicated, because Fletcher was now dealing with a legal threat to his land holdings that occupied his full strategic attention. Garrett was accustomed to operating within the shelter of Cornelius Fletcher's power. Without that shelter, clearly available to him, he was more exposed than he was comfortable with. He made a decision that a cooler and more patient man would not have made. He rode to Millie Garner's house on a Tuesday morning, knowing Eva was there, knowing Elijah was in Borden City with Sinclair Marsh. He knocked on the door and Millie answered it with a dish towel in her hand and an expression that communicated clearly that she was not intimidated by him in any way. "I need to speak with Eva," he said. "Eva is not available," Millie said. "I will wait," he said. "You will leave," Millie said pleasantly. He pushed the door open. It was a mistake, both in the immediate sense and in the broader legal sense. Millie was 63 years old and had spent 40 years on the frontier, and she had a derringer in her apron pocket that she produced with a speed and calm that stopped Garrett Hollies in the doorway as effectively as a wall. "I said," Millie repeated, "you will leave." Garrett left. He was not accustomed to derringers in the hands of elderly women with absolutely steady nerves, and he found the experience disorienting enough to interrupt his rage for a moment. That interruption was enough for the cooler part of his thinking to reassert itself with a warning. He was taking actions that, if witnessed and reported, created a legal record of threatening behavior that would damage him in the coming court proceedings. He rode away. Eva, who had heard the exchange from the back room, came out and found Millie calmly replacing the derringer in her apron pocket. "Thank you," Eva said. "That man is afraid," Millie said. "Afraid men do stupid things." "Do not be alone until this is settled." Eva was not alone. Elijah returned from Borden City that evening and took a room at the boarding house in the nearby town of Crane Creek, which was a 30-minute ride from Millie's house. He came every day. They worked through the documents together, organizing everything for Sinclair Marsh. The letter from Alton Price was, as Eva had assessed, devastating in its clarity. Price had written it apparently intending to clear his conscience before his death, naming specific surveys, specific date alterations, specific payments received from Cornelius Fletcher in exchange for adjusted measurements. Marsh read it and then read it again and then sat back in his chair and said, "This changes the scope of everything substantially." "How substantially?" Elijah asked. "We are no longer talking about a single boundary dispute," Marsh said. "We are talking about a systemic fraud perpetrated over the better part of a decade. 5 families have potential claims based on these documents. The Crane family is one of them." "The others?" Eva asked. Marsh named 4 families. Eva knew 2 of them, the Hartwell family, who had been running cattle on a shortened range for 15 years, and the Medina family, Spanish land grant holders whose eastern pasture had been absorbed into the Fletcher holdings following a survey challenge in 1866. She had wondered for years about the Medinas. She had not asked because she had not wanted the answer. "We need to contact each of them," Eva said. "They have the right to know." "We will," Marsh said. "One step at a time. The Crane case is first. It establishes the precedent. If we win it, the others follow." Cornelius Fletcher received the amended filing that included the additional documentary evidence on a Wednesday afternoon, delivered to him by the county sheriff's deputy, who performed this duty with the discomfort of a man serving papers on the most powerful person in his professional life. Cornelius read the filing. He read it twice. He sat with it for the rest of the day. That evening, he did something that surprised everyone who knew him. He sent a message to Eva at Millie Garner's house. Not demanding, requesting, A request to meet just the two of them at the boundary creek where she had always ridden. She went. She was there before he arrived, sitting on Sadie's back in the early morning light, watching him come down the ridge, and she saw in the way he rode, the set of his shoulders, that he was carrying something different than his customary armored confidence. He rode up and stopped, and they looked at each other for a long moment. "I have been thinking," Cornelius Fletcher said, "about your mother." Eva said nothing, simply waited. "She would have done exactly what you are doing," he said. "She always said I took too much. I told her she did not understand the nature of what I was building." He paused. "I have been sitting in that study for 2 days wondering if she was right." "She was right," Eva said gently. He looked at the creek. "The Alton Price letter, you took it." "I did. It was in my desk for 10 years, he said. "I kept it because I could not bring myself to destroy it. I do not know entirely why." Eva watched her father's face. She had known this man all her life and had never expected to see this expression on it. Not defeat, not exactly. Something more complicated. The look of a man who has spent 60 years telling himself a particular story and has recently become unable to continue believing it. "I will not fight the Crane case," Cornelius said. "I am withdrawing the counterclaim." The silence was enormous. "The boundary will be corrected," he continued. "The other claims, I will need time, but I will not fight any of them through dishonest means." He paused. "I am not saying this because I expect absolution. I am saying it because it is the right thing and I have waited too long to do it." Eva felt something break open in her chest, something she had been holding tight for a long time. She urged Sadie forward and reached out and touched her father's hand where it rested on his saddle horn. He covered her hand with his. They sat there like that for a moment, saying nothing, while the creek ran over its stones. "The fence builder," Cornelius said finally, with something that was almost amusement in his voice. "He has a great deal of nerve." "Yes," Eva said. "It is one of my favorite things about him." "Bring him to dinner," Cornelius said. "Let me look at him properly." The dinner at the Fletcher Ranch house, a week later, was an event that would be discussed in Sutter's Valley for months in its own right, separate from everything else that was already being discussed. The hands who served noticed that Cornelius Fletcher had put on his best suit. They noticed that Eva arrived with a man they recognized from the eastern boundary work, clean-shaven, dressed in what were clearly his best clothes, carrying himself with the quiet and unperformed confidence that apparently did not diminish even when he was walking into the domain of the man who had been trying to remove him from the picture for 2 months. Cornelius and Elijah sat across from each other at the long table, and Eva sat at the corner between them, and the conversation was the most careful and most honest one that had happened in that room in many years. Cornelius asked direct questions. What were Elijah's intentions toward Eva? What did he have? What did he intend to build? Elijah answered each question directly and without embellishment. He had skills and a plan and no apologies to make for having come to this table without a cattle empire behind him. He said plainly that he intended to marry Eva if she would have him, and that he intended to earn the life they would build together with his own hands, and that he was not asking for Cornelius's blessing as a prerequisite, but that he was asking for it because Eva loved her father and that mattered. Cornelius studied him for a long time after that. Then he said, "You are not what I planned." "No," Elijah agreed. "That appears to be your principal asset," Cornelius said, and something in his voice had shifted into something that was not warmth exactly, but was the shadow cast by it. "Eva has never been interested in what I planned." Eva reached under the table and pressed Elijah's hand briefly. He felt it and was still. "She is the best thing I have ever done," Cornelius said, to Elijah directly, in a voice that was roughened by something he clearly had not intended to let through. "I have not always known how to show her that. I intend to do better." The evening ended with the three of them on the front porch as the stars came out over the valley, drinking coffee and watching the dark, and when Elijah and Eva rode back toward Millie's house together through the cool fall air, they rode close enough that their knees touched and neither of them pulled away. "He is going to be all right," Eva said. "I believe you," Elijah said. He is harder to hate in person than in principle. He always has been, Eva said. That has been the complicated thing. Eva, he said, and he pulled his horse up gently and she pulled up beside him and they were stopped in the road with the star-salted dark above them and the dry, sweet smell of the late-season grass all around. I came to this valley for a legal purpose. I found something I was not looking for. I want you to know that the boundary case, as important as it is to me, is not the thing that I will look back on as the reason I was here. She looked at him in the starlight. Ask me properly, she said. He did. It was not elaborate. It did not need to be. It was a straightforward question asked by a man who understood the value of plainness and precision in the things that mattered most. She said yes before he had finished asking it. The Crane boundary case was heard in Borden City District Court on the 14th of November, 1878. Cornelius Fletcher appeared in person, and to the visible astonishment of the gallery, testified voluntarily in support of the Crane filing, confirming the fraudulent nature of the 1864 survey, and acknowledging that the eastern grazing land had been improperly incorporated into the Fletcher holdings. Sinclair Marsh introduced the Alton Price letter and the supporting documentation. The judge, a man named Walcott who had a reputation for slow deliberation and iron conclusions, ruled in favor of the Crane claim before the week was out. The eastern parcel was restored to the Crane family. Burl Crane, sitting in the gallery for the ruling, was a weathered and careful man who showed very little on his face as a general rule. When the judge announced the finding, he pressed his lips together hard for a moment and his eyes went bright. He stood outside the courthouse afterward in the November sun and shook Elijah's hand without speaking for a moment, and then he said, "Your grandmother would have been proud." "So would yours," Elijah said. Eva, standing beside Elijah, watched the two cousins and felt the specific satisfaction of a wrong partially set right. Partial because there were 4 other families whose claims were pending, whose processes would take more time, but begun. The mechanism was running now, and there was no reversing it. Garrett Hollies, who had attended the hearing, left Borden City without speaking to anyone. He rode back toward his ranch to the north and did not appear in the valley's social calendar for several months. The story that eventually circulated was that he had sold a portion of his northern range and retreated into a smaller operation, chastened in ways that the valley found quietly satisfying. The betrothal that had been so carefully constructed between the Fletcher and Hollies operations dissolved without ceremony, to the visible relief of no one more than Eva Fletcher. Roper Hadley departed the valley entirely, which most people considered appropriate. Elijah and Eva were married on the second Saturday of December, 1878, in the Sutter's Valley Church, which was a small white building that held perhaps 60 people, and which on that day held over 100, most of them standing. Millie Garner sat in the front row and cried without apology. Cornelius Fletcher walked Eva up the aisle, and at the altar performed the handoff with a care and solemnity that was so uncharacteristic of the public image of Cornelius Fletcher that it generated its own current of whispered comment through the assembled congregation. Burl Crane was there. The younger Fletcher hands were there, Cotto Reeves conspicuously in the front section. The Hartwell family was there, and the Medina family, whose claim was now pending in the same court system that had ruled on the Crane case. Sinclair Marsh was there, looking pleased with himself in the way of a man whose professional instincts have been vindicated. Eva came down the aisle in a dress that Millie had helped her construct over 3 frantic weeks, dark blue wool because it was December, and because Eva Fletcher had never worn white in her life and was not about to start. She wore her mother's silver earrings, which Cornelius had pressed into her hand the morning of the wedding with the same roughened voice he had used at the dinner table, and she carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers that she had collected herself from the eastern boundary. Elijah, watching her come toward him, thought of the first morning he had turned and found her there on her gray mare, looking at him with those direct and unhurried eyes, and he understood with a completeness that surprised even him how thoroughly the purpose that had brought him to Sutter's Valley had been braided together with the person standing in front of him until the two were inseparable. The vows were said. The minister concluded his portion. Elijah kissed her in the particular way he had come to understand she preferred, with his full attention and without performance, and the congregation produced a sound that the valley would talk about with affection for a long time. They settled on land at the edge of the valley, east of the Crane property, on a parcel that Cornelius quietly arranged without announcement, a gesture that cost him nothing financially and cost him something more significant internally, which was the acknowledgement that what he was giving his daughter was not a prize but an apology. The land was beautiful. It sat along the upper reach of the creek, in the shade of the cottonwoods that Elijah had come to associate with every important moment of the last 3 months of his life. He built the house himself, not alone. Burl Crane brought his hands to help and the Fletcher hands helped on weekends, and Cato Reeves proved to be a surprisingly capable carpenter. By February of 1879, they had a house that was modest in size, but built with the particular care of someone who understands that structures intended for the long term deserve real attention. Every joint was true. Every wall was square. The windows faced southeast to catch the morning light, because Eva had told him once in passing that she had always wanted windows that faced the morning, and he had remembered. Eva established, in the first year of the marriage, several things about the kind of household she intended to run. She kept the survey records and the legal correspondence from the boundary cases organized in a cabinet in the front room, because the remaining cases for the Hartwell and Medina families and 2 others were ongoing, and she intended to remain involved in them. She rode Sadie every morning still, sometimes alone and sometimes with Elijah, and they maintained the habit of talking about everything, the land, the cases, the valley, the future, with the same directness they had developed on the creek bank. The valley talked about them constantly, as promised. Every variation of opinion had its spokesman. Some people believed Eva Fletcher had thrown herself away on a fence builder and would come to regret it. Some people believed she had performed the most sensible act in the history of the valley by choosing a man based on his character rather than his land holdings. A significant portion of the population found the entire story thrillingly scandalous and repeated their favorite version of it at every opportunity. The Medina family's case was resolved in their favor in March of 1879. The Hartwell case was resolved in June. The 2 remaining cases, involving families whose properties were further from the valley center and whose cases involved more complex documentary issues, were resolved by the end of 1879. In each case, Cornelius Fletcher testified voluntarily, and in each case he absorbed the legal and financial consequences without complaint. It cost him substantially. It did not ruin him. He was a man who had accumulated enough that even returning what did not belong to him left him comfortable. What it did to his standing in the valley was more complicated, a mixture of contempt from those who had profited alongside him and a grudging respect from those who had always doubted him, the latter category growing larger as time passed. He came to Sunday dinner at Elijah and Eva's house with a regularity that surprised people who had expected the father-daughter breach to be permanent. He sat at their table with the diminished and somewhat altered quality of a man who has come through a significant internal reckoning and emerged changed in ways he does not fully advertise. He and Elijah developed, over months of those Sunday dinners, a relationship that was not warm in any conventional sense but was deeply honest, which suited both of them better than warmth would have. One Sunday in October of 1879, Cornelius arrived for dinner and found Eva on the porch with a particular stillness that he recognized from her childhood, the stillness of important news being organized before delivery. "You are going to be a grandfather," she told him. Cornelius Fletcher, cattle baron, empire builder, man of 60 years of relentless and frequently unscrupulous acquisition, sat down on the porch step and was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up at her with an expression that she had not seen on his face since her mother had been alive, open and unguarded and full of something that was simply human. "Good," he said. That was all. But it was enough. The winter of 1879 moved through the valley with its usual severity, dry cold and long nights, and the particular beauty of frost on the cottonwood branches along the creek. Eva was pregnant with intention and equanimity, continuing to ride Sadie until December when the pregnancy made it impractical, conducting her correspondence and record-keeping with the same systematic focus she always had, feeding the kitchen fire against the cold, reading in the evenings with Elijah in the chair beside her, his hand resting on her knee with the settled and unconscious naturalness of a man who has found his place and stopped looking for reasons to doubt it. They talked about names. They argued pleasantly about whether the house needed a second window on the north wall. He read to her from the geographical history she had given him a year ago, the one with her margin notes, which he had kept beside his bedroll and which now sat on the shelf he had built specifically for books, the first thing he had built inside the house before even the furniture was finished. She pointed out that her margin notes were better than the text, and he said he knew that was why he was reading both. In the spring of 1880, in the second week of April, their son was born. He arrived with the particular insistence of someone who had been waiting long enough, and he was healthy and loud from the first moment, which Elijah considered an excellent sign, and which made Millie Garner, who was present for the birth, laugh out loud and say that he had his mother's temperament already and the valley should prepare itself. They named him Samuel Crane Lawson, Samuel for Elijah's father and Crane for the reason that should be obvious to anyone paying attention, which the valley was. The valley, to no one's surprise, found this naming choice worth talking about for several weeks and concluded, with the collective wisdom available to it, that it was the most Eva Fletcher thing that Eva Fletcher had ever done, which was saying something. Burl Crane, when he heard the name, looked at Elijah for a long moment and then looked at the baby in Eva's arms and said nothing at all, which was how Burl Crane expressed things that went too deep for words. Cornelius held his grandson for the first time on a gray April morning when the creek was running high with snowmelt, and the cottonwoods were putting out their first yellow-green leaves. He held him with the careful inexperience of a man who had not held a baby in 30 years, and the baby looked up at him with the uncritical attention of a person who has no framework yet for judging anyone, and Cornelius said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "I will do better by this one." Eva heard him. She chose not to say anything. She simply noted it as the particular truth it was. The years that followed were not easy in the way that fairy tales are easy. They were the real kind of not easy, full of dry seasons and difficult negotiations, and the grinding work of building something new on land that had formerly been the site of old wrongs. The remaining legal processes from the boundary cases threw occasional complications up, moments when Elijah had to return to Borden City and spend days in Sinclair Marsh's office working through documents and counterfilings from parties less willing than Cornelius to accept the correction of the record. There were years when the cattle market dropped and the household accounts were tight, and Eva managed both the books and her own considerable anxiety about them with a precision that Elijah found both admirable and, on the tight years, faintly terrifying. There were arguments, because they were two strong-willed and articulate people sharing a life, and arguments were inevitable. They argued about the pace of things, about risk, about what to hold on to and what to let go. They argued with the full force of their intelligence and without the tools of contempt or dismissal, which are the instruments that actually damage. They had learned, each of them, from watching other kinds of arguments, the kind her father used as weapons, the kind Garrett Hollies deployed as control, and they had decided without explicitly stating it that theirs would be different. They were different. The valley's fascination with them did not diminish, though it changed in character as the years passed. It became less the fascinated horror of watching a scandal unfold, and more the quieter and more genuine interest of watching something true. People in Sutter's Valley noticed, in the way that communities do when they pay attention over time, that the Lawson marriage was a thing of substance. They noticed that Elijah Lawson had expanded his work beyond fence building into a genuine land surveying and legal consulting practice that served every family in the valley regardless of how much money they had. They noticed that Eva Lawson, which was how she introduced herself now without any conflicted feeling about the name, was involved in every significant land rights case that came through the valley, and that she had become, informally but effectively, the person that the smaller homesteading families brought their documents to when they needed someone who could read them clearly and without intimidation. They noticed that Cornelius Fletcher came to Sunday dinner every week, and that his health, which had been declining in 1880, had stabilized in a way that his doctor attributed to the moderate lifestyle, and that everyone else attributed to the grandchildren. Samuel was followed 2 years later by a daughter, Margaret, named for Eva's mother, who arrived with her father's steady eyes and her mother's complete absence of any interest in being told what to do. Margaret was followed 3 years after that by another boy, Thomas, who was quieter than both his siblings and who showed, from early childhood, the same quality his father had when measuring a fence post, the quality of looking at a problem until you understood it completely before touching it. Millie Garner lived to see all 3 of them born and was as central to the household as any blood relation. She occupied the room they had built onto the east side of the house specifically for her, because the ride from her own homestead had become too much as she got older, and she filled that room with her books and her derringer, and her complete lack of interest in being treated as anything other than a full participant in everything that happened around her. Cornelius Fletcher died in 1886, in his 71st year, in the big room of the main ranch house, with the evening light coming through the windows and Eva sitting beside him, holding his hand. He had been declining for several months and had done so with the same directness that had characterized everything else about him, meeting the fact of it without drama or denial. He and Eva had used those months well, better perhaps than any period in their shared history, talking about things that had never been said between them, the ways he had failed her, the ways he had tried, the shape of what her mother had been and what her absence had done to both of them. He left the ranch house and the main operation to Eva outright, with no conditions and no intermediary. He left instructions with his attorney that the remaining legal and financial obligations from the boundary corrections were to be honored in full from the estate. He left a letter for Elijah, which Elijah read privately and which he never described to anyone in detail, except to say that it was the most honest thing Cornelius Fletcher had ever written, and that he was glad to have received it. The valley mourned Cornelius Fletcher in the complicated way that valleys mourn powerful men who have done both harm and good, with the particular human capacity for holding contradictions without resolving them. There were people who thought well of him for what he had done in his final years. There were people who remembered only the decades before. Eva held all of it, the full complicated accounting, and did not require anyone to simplify it for her comfort. The Fletcher Ranch did not become a Fletcher Ranch under Eva's stewardship. She kept the land and the cattle operation, which Elijah and Cato Reeves, now a seasoned and trusted hand, and eventually the operations foreman, ran with a competence that the operation had not seen even in its most ambitious years. But she changed the name, not to Lawson, though that would have been simple, but to something she had been thinking about since the day she had ridden back along the eastern boundary the morning after her father's funeral, with the early light on the cottonwoods and the creek running clear, and the land looking as it must have looked before any of them had arrived to claim it. She named it the Cottonwood Creek Ranch, which was a name that meant nothing proprietary about anyone who owned it and everything particular about the land itself. The valley, of course, talked about this decision extensively. In 1888, a decade almost exactly after the morning that Elijah Lawson had turned from his fence post and seen Eva Fletcher on her gray mare, they rode the eastern boundary together in the September heat, the same September dry heat that had characterized that first morning, the grass the same pale gold, the cottonwoods thick and green along the creek. Samuel was 8 years old and had been allowed to come on this ride because he had, that morning, completed every one of his assigned chores before being asked twice, which Eva had declared constituted sufficient qualification for the privilege. He rode between them on a small bay gelding, his face turned up toward the sky and then toward the creek, and then toward his father with the easy swiveling attention of a child who finds everything interesting. He was asking Elijah about the survey stakes they were passing, what the numbers meant, how you measured a line between 2 points when the land between them was uneven. Elijah answered each question with the same patience he applied to everything, explaining the tools and the mathematics and the principle of it, and Eva rode alongside and listened to her son asking the same kinds of questions she had been asking herself when she was not much older than him, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a woman who has built the life she chose rather than the life she was assigned, and who knows the difference. "Papa," Samuel said, "why did you come here in the first place?" Elijah glanced across at Eva. She was looking at the creek with a small smile that he recognized as the specific smile she had when she was thinking something she was waiting to see if he would say out loud. "To understand the land," Elijah said, "to make sure it was given back to the right people." "And then you stayed," Samuel said. "And then I stayed," Elijah agreed. "Because of Mama, because of your mother," Elijah said, "among other reasons." "What other reasons?" Samuel asked. Eva looked over at Elijah then, the full look, direct and unhurried, the same look she had given him from the back of Sadie on that first September morning, and it still had the quality of being seen completely that he had never encountered in anyone else and had never stopped being grateful for. "Because," Elijah said, "some places are worth staying in." They rode the length of the eastern boundary together, the 3 of them, in the September heat, and the cottonwoods stood thick and green along the creek, and the fence posts that Elijah had sunk with such mechanical precision 10 years before had weathered to gray and held their line true, as well-built things do. The valley stretched around them in every direction, old and full of its own stories, none of which it would stop telling any time soon. The valley had talked about Eva Fletcher and the fence builder for a year, and then for another year after that, and then for another. What the valley had not entirely anticipated in its first shocked year of commentary was that what it was witnessing was not a scandal with a short shelf life, but the beginning of something that would outlast the scandal entirely, something that the valley would eventually stop calling scandalous and start calling simply true. A woman who had chosen with her full self rather than her assigned role. A man who had come for justice and found something he had not known to look for. A family built on honesty even when honesty was expensive. A piece of land called Cottonwood Creek, where the fence lines were correct and the water ran clear and the house windows faced the morning. The year it had taken to build this, the year the valley had talked about nothing else, had been full of confrontation and betrayal and forced choice, and the exposure of secrets and the cost of truth, and the specific terror of refusing the trap that has been built for you with the best available materials. It had been full of all of those things, and it had been worth every one of them. Elijah Lawson put his hand out across the space between their horses, and Eva Fletcher, who had been Eva Lawson for 10 years and intended to be Eva Lawson for 40 more, took it, and they rode the eastern boundary of the land they had built their life on together, and the September light was warm and steady, and the valley was exactly as it always was, full of its opinions and its history and its capacity for being surprised by the things that love turns out to be made of. And the cottonwoods stood along the creek as they had stood for 100 years, and would stand for 100 more, patient and particular and rooted, in the way of things that have found the place they were meant to be.